The Flaxborough Corn Exchange, a building whose name promised grain but generally delivered committee meetings, stood that evening dressed in banners, chrysanthemums, and a rather over-enthusiastic velvet curtain. It was the night of the annual Civic Remembrance Concert, an event which, year after year, tried to evoke solemnity but usually achieved mild fidgeting and the faint smell of boiled wool. Inspector Purbright, neither fidgeting nor woolly, had attended out of courtesy. He sat 3 rows from the back, where one could observe the audience as much as the stage. The townsfolk, bundled in coats they refused to surrender to the cloakroom, had arranged themselves with the calm determination of people claiming their favourite pew at church. Murmurs drifted around him like slow-moving fog. The soloist, a visiting operatic baritone whose name and moustache were of similar extravagant length, had just launched into the opening verses of an Edwardian naval lament when something queer happened backstage. At first, Purbright thought it a trick of the stage lights, a faint pulse of gold behind the wings. But the pulse grew. It became a small but definite flare, a glow, candlelight. Then came the commotion, a gasp from the soprano waiting in the wings, a clatter like falling tin, and the baritone's voice crashing down half a tone in alarm. The audience tensed, or more precisely, leaned forward in collective hope that something genuinely interesting was happening. From the side hatch, one of the junior councillors emerged, flapping his arms as if trying to guide imaginary aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay seated. A minor, backstage matter." This reassurance had precisely the opposite effect intended. Several elderly women stood up at once, causing a rustle like a startled flock. A man near Purbright whispered to his wife, "It'll be those stage school girls again. They set fire to a tablecloth in '82. Purbright rose quietly and made his way to the aisle just as Superintendent Harcourt Warlock appeared at the back, summoned from the foyer bar where he had been quietly wishing the concert ill. The 2 men exchanged a look, suggesting equal resignation. By the time they reached the wings, the glow had softened into a tremulous flicker. A backstage attendant, a girl who looked too young for panic but too earnest for composure, pointed to a half-open door. "In there," she gulped. The candle." It was indeed a candle, squat, half-melted and planted in a chipped saucer. Around it, on the floor of the storage cupboard, sat 3 objects arranged with a puzzling neatness: an empty opera program, an old railway timetable, and a cracked white teacup. They formed something like a triangle, its apex pointing toward the candle. Warlock frowned. Some idiot's idea of a shrine? Purbright examined the arrangement, his expression neither impressed nor dismissive. "Odd," he murmured, "but not dangerous." The baritone appeared behind them, clutching his cloak dramatically about him. "Inspector, Superintendent, I demand to know whether this is an attempt at intimidation. My artistry has long provoked envy." Warlock regarded him with the kind of politeness usually reserved for persistent salesmen. "There's no indication of sabotage, sir." "To an untrained eye, perhaps," the baritone sniffed. "This reeks of symbolic menace." Purbright let the words drift past him like wood smoke. His gaze returned to the timetable, a folded pamphlet bearing the faded emblem of Flaxborough and District Railway, a company that had died long before most of the audience had taken to paying council tax. He touched it lightly. "Curious choice of literature for a concert," he said. Behind them, someone whispered sharply, "Not again!" It was the mayor's wife, her hand pressed to her collar, as though shielding herself from cold. But the hall was warm, almost too warm, what with the crush of bodies and the stage lights. Purbright caught the remark. "Mrs. Laxby? You've seen something similar?" Her eyes darted, embarrassed. "I... Oh, it's nothing. Just a silly memory, probably irrelevant." Purbright said and filed the comment gently away. Warlock blew out the candle with unnecessary vigour. "Well, whoever put this here has given me paperwork, which I shall not thank them for." The councillors fussed around them, their main concern clearly being whether the press had noticed anything. Councillor Goffin, a man who considered himself Flaxborough's guardian against scandal, leaned close and whispered conspiratorially, "If you ask me, Inspector, this is hooliganism. Young people these days set candles burning over all sorts of nonsense." Purbright smiled mildly. "Let us not assume the young have a monopoly on nonsense." By the time the excitement had thinned and the concert resumed, the baritone regaining only some of his dignity, Purbright had been given a great deal of irrelevant information by several bystanders. Everyone had seen something, though none had seen the same thing. One lady insisted she had smelled lavender, another swore she had heard humming, a third complained that she had missed the climax of the lament entirely and hoped the police would compensate her. But it was the mayor's wife who lingered in Purbright's thoughts as he stood at the back of the hall once more. Her comment, "Not again," had been too soft for theatrics, too spontaneous for fabrication. And as the final chorus swelled with dutiful solemnity, Purbright found himself glancing toward the stage-left corridor, where that faint, earlier glow had beckoned like a secret. Flaxborough did not often produce mysteries of any grandeur, but it excelled at producing small, curious human puzzles. This one, he suspected, had only just begun to warm. The Civic Remembrance concert ended with the usual mixture of relief and mildly strained applause. People shuffled out of the corn exchange in compact murmuring clusters, each eager to be first to divulge or embellish an account of the evening's excitement. Flaxborough, ordinarily a model of slow, predictable civility, had been gifted a small mystery, and the townsfolk embraced it with all the reverence of children offered a forbidden sweet. Inspector Purbright walked with the departing crowd at an unhurried pace, observing as gossip took shape with the swiftness and confidence of ivy climbing a wall. Beside him, Superintendent Warlock grumbled about the draught near the lobby doors, though his expression carried a faint alertness that suggested he was listening as keenly as any housewife in the audience. Near the program table, two elderly sisters debated in fierce whispers. "It was a warning," declared the taller one, adjusting her beret as if to lend authority to her claim. "Mark me, a warning to that opera fellow. You saw how he trembled." Her sister sniffed. "He trembles by profession, but that candle, I don't like it. Reminds me of those spiritualist evenings at the post office." Purbright inclined his head politely when they glanced his way, though their conversation continued without the slightest pause. Across the foyer, the baritone himself, wrapped tightly in his voluminous cloak, held court with a local reporter who seemed torn between sympathy and hunger for scandal. The singer gestured dramatically toward the stage doors, his voice carrying phrases like malevolent theatre folk and professional jealousy. The reporter, scribbling vigorously, nodded as though absorbing revelations of national significance. Warlock growled, "If he's not careful, he'll have half the county believing some secret society is out to silence him." Purbright responded in his calm, dry voice. "Flaxborough does relish a theory, and a dramatic theory even more so." The superintendent snorted. "Wait until Councillor Goffin adds his wisdom to the matter. That'll be the death of any remaining common sense." As if summoned by his own reputation, Goffin approached, his expression grave with self-importance. Inspector Superintendent, I'm relieved you've remained on hand. I've been giving the incident considerable thought." Purbright offered him the kind of polite smile one reserves for people determined to share thoughts regardless of encouragement. "Always valuable, Councillor. Goffin leaned forward, lowering his voice, though he was clearly pleased to be overheard. It was a prank, you know. I'd wager anything on it. One of those dreadful youths from the technical college. They were lurking outside earlier. Lurking. Lurking? Warlock repeated. Doing what? Well, standing about, whispering. Goffin's face flushed at his own vagueness. I know mischief when I see it. Purbright considered the counsellor's earnest expression. A reasonable hypothesis, he said courteously, though perhaps we might gather more detail before reaching a conclusion. Goffin pressed his lips together, interpreting this as agreement rather than a gentle contradiction. He hurried off toward another cluster of listeners, no doubt to disseminate his newly confirmed theory. Purbright and Warlock stepped outside into the cool evening air. The lamps along the high street cast their familiar honeyed glow on the cobbles, and the mist rising from the river lent the scene a soft, ghost-like shimmer. People moved in slow, drifting knots, their voices overlapping in a tapestry of speculation. A group of choir members lingered near the statue of the town's long-forgotten benefactor. One, a stout woman in a plum-coloured coat, was insisting to her companions that she had seen an unfamiliar figure backstage mere minutes before the candle was discovered. He was tall, well, taller than me at any rate. Wearing a dark coat, she said. He didn't look like he belonged. Had the air of someone hiding something. Another choir member huffed. Anyone would look suspicious in that crush of scenery. Perhaps it was only the new lighting technician. There is no new lighting technician, the first replied triumphantly. This revelation prompted a renewed swell of speculation, each theory more embroidered than the last. Purbright listened without appearing to do so, filing away the hint of an unidentified presence backstage. It was vague, perhaps unreliable, but Flaxborough's most improbable remarks were often the threads that eventually led to something solid. Warlock adjusted his overcoat and nodded toward the square. Harcourt's tea rooms will be full of tongues wagging tomorrow, and the Chronicle will demand a statement before lunch. Then we shall give them a statement, Purbright murmured, though perhaps not the one they expect. They walked slowly along the pavement, acknowledging greetings from townsfolk who behaved as though the police were already deep in a labyrinthine investigation. Some asked cautious questions, others offered unsolicited recollections. A young man claimed to have seen smoke drifting from a window at the exact moment the baritone hit a particularly unpleasant high note. A retired schoolmaster insisted he had detected the scent of beeswax, which he associated with eccentric religious groups. A woman with a poodle suggested it might be connected to the missing library books mentioned in last week's newspaper. Purbright thanked everyone with mild patience, gently sorting the misinformation from the merely absurd. As they neared the river bridge, footsteps hurried behind them. Purbright recognized the nervous stride before turning. It was the backstage attendant, the earnest young woman who had first pointed out the cupboard. She approached with cheeks pink from cold and anxiety. "Inspector, sorry to bother you, but I remembered something. It may not matter, it probably doesn't matter, but—" Purbright smiled encouragingly. "In my experience, the things people think do not matter often prove the most instructive." She clutched her coat collar. "Well, earlier, before the concert started, I found the door to the storage cupboard slightly open, only a crack. I thought nothing of it, but now I'm sure I closed it after the rehearsal." "You closed it yourself?" Purbright asked, his tone light. "Yes, Mr. Dell, the custodian, had asked us all to tidy the wings before the audience arrived. I remember shutting that door, I'd swear to it." "And was anything inside unusual at that time?" She shook her head firmly. "No candle, no objects, just the usual mess of stands and props." Purbright nodded slowly. "Thank you. You've been very helpful." As she hurried back across the square, Warlock exhaled a thoughtful sigh. So someone had access to that cupboard between rehearsal and the performance? "Possibly during the performance as well," Purbright said. "Backstage movement is not always easy to track." The inspector's gaze drifted toward the darkened corn exchange. He pictured the modest tableau in the cupboard, the candle, the program, the timetable, the cracked teacup. It had not felt random. Careless hands would have scattered things, not arranged them with deliberate symmetry. There had been no scorch marks, no signs of mischief beyond the flame itself. It was almost ceremonial, though to what purpose he could not yet guess. Warlock cleared his throat. "You think there's more to this than a prank?" Purbright's quiet smile resurfaced. "I think, Superintendent, that someone wished to be noticed but not identified. That is seldom an adolescent ambition." They stood for a moment listening to the distant chatter still trickling from the direction of the corn exchange. The night felt heavier now, as if the mist had thickened in response to the evening's confusion. Purbright straightened his coat. "Tomorrow, we shall visit Mr. Dell. A missing key, a cupboard that won't stay shut, and an arrangement of curious objects. These seem a gentlemanly place to begin." Warlock nodded. "And the mayor's wife?" "Yes," Purbright said softly. "Her remark, I think, should not be ignored." They walked on in companionable silence, the mystery settling around them like a slow-burning candle flame, faint, contained, yet undeniably alive. Morning arrived in Flaxborough with its usual mild reluctance, the sort that made the town seem permanently 5 minutes behind schedule. Mist curled over the cobbles outside the police station, softening outlines and giving everything the gentle uncertainty of a half-remembered dream. Inspector Purbright found it rather apt for the day's inquiries. Superintendent Warlock was already in his office, sorting through a stack of forms that appeared to have doubled overnight. He glanced up as Purbright entered with his customary calm. "Well, Inspector," he said, "shall we go see our friend Mr. Dell before the town convinces itself we're hunting a coven?" Purbright smiled. "It may already be too late for that, but yes. A custodian's cupboards often conceal more truth than a counsellor's speeches." They set out for the corn exchange, which appeared bleary and chastened after the previous night's excitement. A pair of pigeons strutted meaningfully near the steps, as though inspecting structural integrity. Inside, the air still held a faint whiff of wax and stage dust. Mr. Dell, the custodian, was a man who seemed perpetually apologetic for the existence of objects. His shoulders hunched near anything that might fall, stain, creak, or trip someone. When Purbright and Warlock approached him in the foyer, he greeted them with a sigh that suggested personal guilt for the candle incident. "I knew summit like this had happen again," he muttered, wringing his cap. "Cupboards aren't to be trusted. Folks keep wandering into them." "Again?" Purbright asked gently. "Have you had trouble with that particular cupboard before?" "Not that cupboard," Dell corrected with weary precision. "The one next to it?" "Last year, for the harvest play, someone left a sandwich box inside. In summer. Took 3 days to find the source of the smell. I warned them then, cupboards attract trouble." Purbright absorbed this with his usual mild respect. "Possibly. But tell me, how many people have keys to the backstage area?" "Only 6, Dell replied proudly. "Me, the stage manager, the lighting operator, Councillor Goffin, though why he needs one I'll never know, and the 2 caretakers." "Anyone borrow a key last night?" Warlock asked. Dell scratched his cheek. "Not borrow, but... Well, the mayor's wife did ask to step backstage before the concert. Said she'd lost a glove at the rehearsal and wanted to check." Purbright exchanged a quiet glance with Warlock. Did she find it? She said she didn't, looked a bit rattled going out, but I didn't see her near the cupboard. Was the cupboard door shut when you checked before the performance? Purbright asked. Dell hesitated. I think so. I did a tidy round. Could have been open a crack. Those old hinges don't lie flush, you see. Always said they needed replacing. They followed him backstage. The cupboard appeared as small, drab, and unilluminated as any other storage space in rural England. Yet something about it carried a lingering echo of last night's unsettling glow. Purbright knelt, studying the floor. Someone placed the candle with care, and the objects. They weren't dropped by accident. Dell shivered. It's unnatural, like one of those memorial things folk leave at bus stops. Perhaps, Purbright murmured, or perhaps someone wished to remind another person of something specific. Warlock folded his arms. But of what, the timetable, the teacup? Purbright stood slowly. Memory, he said, not quite answering. Memory can be arranged as deliberately as objects. Dell, wholly perplexed, decided the safest option was to offer tea. They declined politely. Their next call was the stage manager, Miss Myrtle Fenn, a woman with brisk efficiency and the temperament of someone who had spent 30 years neutralizing amateur actors' catastrophes. She met them in the dressmaking room where bolts of fabric stood stiffly like rejected cast members. Miss Fenn claimed to have seen nothing unusual. I'm far too busy keeping egos from knocking over scenery to worry about candles, she said. But I did hear Mr. Matchlock, the baritone, complaining earlier about a presence backstage. I assumed he meant his conscience. Purbright thanked her, though she clearly wished to offer a list of further grievances unrelated to the investigation. The opera singer himself awaited them in the green room, reclining on a sofa as though he had survived a shipwreck. He rose dramatically upon their entry. "Inspector," he intoned, "I trust you are closing in on the culprit." "We are merely gathering impressions," Purbright replied politely. "Could you tell me again what you observed?" The baritone launched into a vivid narrative, featuring sinister shadows, a whisper of cold air, and an uneasy intuition that his destiny was entangled with a malevolent force. Purbright listened without interruption, cataloguing the useful morsels buried within the flamboyant embellishments. Warlock, less patient, eventually interjected. "To clarify, you saw no person, heard no footstep, and observed nothing aside from the candle once it was found." The baritone looked mildly offended. "Artistic people perceive the invisible." Purbright nodded understandingly. "Thank you. If anything else occurs to you, anything at all, do inform us." Their most promising interview, however, came when they encountered the backstage attendant again, the earnest young woman with the tendency to apologize to furniture. She had been sorting sheet music near the orchestra pit. "Did you remember anything more?" Purbright asked. She hesitated, biting her lip. "Only that, well, when Mrs. Laxby came backstage, she wasn't alone. Someone came with her. I didn't see who. I was behind the curtain, and they went round the corner quickly." "Could you describe anything? Height, clothing?" Warlock asked. "No, just the sound of shoes, light ones, not men's shoes, but the mayor's wife seemed uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be seen with whoever it was." Purbright thanked her warmly, perhaps too warmly for Warlock's liking, as he gave Purbright a sidelong glance afterward. "So," the superintendent muttered as they walked down the corridor, "we have a cupboard, a candle, a baritone with spiritual indigestion, and now secret companions of the mayor's wife." "An improving picture," Purbright said cheerfully. "You find this improving?" "Progress is rarely linear, Superintendent, but it can be cumulative. We now know someone had reason to follow or accompany Mrs. Laxby, and that she had reason to be troubled." Warlock snorted. And what about the items, the teacup, the timetable? They belong together, Purbright replied softly. They spoke of something half-remembered, arranged deliberately, as one might arrange mementos when trying to provoke a specific thought in an observer. Warlock sighed. And who was the observer meant to be? The singer? No, Purbright said. I think the candle was not meant for the audience at all, nor for the police. Someone backstage knew it would be seen by a particular set of eyes. And whose eyes would those be? Warlock asked. Purbright did not answer immediately. Instead, he stopped near the exit doors, gazing thoughtfully at the scratch marks on the metal frame. Recent, faint, and at a strange height. Someone very familiar with this building, he said finally. Someone who knew where to place a message without declaring it openly. Warlock frowned. You're speaking in riddles again? Occupational hazard. Purbright smiled faintly. But we shall see more clearly soon. As they left the corn exchange, the midday sun was attempting to break through the persistent veil of mist, without much success. The town looked softened, uncertain, as though waiting for a cue that had not yet been delivered. Purbright paused on the steps. There is something else, he said. The mayor's wife. Her remark? Not again. She spoke of history, not mischief. You think she knows who placed the objects? I think, Purbright said quietly, that she fears she does. They began the walk back toward the station, the mystery trailing after them like a shadow that refused to fall into step. Flaxborough's morning routines had a remarkable ability to recover from disruption, though not without incorporating the disruption into every cup of tea poured before noon. And by the time Inspector Purbright and Superintendent Warlock returned to the police station, the candle incident had already blossomed into a narrative with enough variations to fuel a full season of gossip. Constable Love, an earnest young man with an anxious relationship to paperwork, greeted them at the front desk with a stack of statements and the strained smile of someone drowning politely. More reports from the public, sir, he said, offering the papers like a peace offering. Several people say they saw suspicious figures near the corn exchange last night. Purbright accepted the stack and skimmed the first page. I see 3 different descriptions here, one short, one tall, one indeterminate. He glanced at Love, kindly. A productive night for suspicious silhouettes. Love cleared his throat. Also, Councillor Goffin has been ringing since 8. He says he has important information. Warlock groaned. Of course he does. Before they could retreat to their offices, the councillor himself appeared in the doorway, carrying the self-importance of an entire committee meeting. His coat flapped behind him like an indignant cape. Inspector, Superintendent, I came at once, he announced, though his flushed cheek suggested he had paused for breakfast on the way. Purbright inclined his head. Good morning, Councillor. Goffin lowered his voice dramatically. I've discovered the culprit, without a doubt, one of our local youths, troublesome sort, always loitering near the corn exchange, a menace. Who exactly? Warlock asked, arms folding. Leonard Briggs, Goffin declared triumphantly. Known prankster, suspended from school last term for carving initials into a cricket pavilion bench. Smash-and-grab temperament, that boy. I've long suspected he'd escalate. Purbright regarded him steadily. Did you see Leonard Briggs last night? No, Goffin admitted, undeterred. But I saw him yesterday afternoon near the exchange, and I heard he was seen near the riverside after dusk. That's quite close, you know, practically adjacent. Warlock rubbed his temples. Councillor, Riverside Lane is a quarter-mile from the corn exchange. Proximity, Goffin insisted, is a hallmark of guilt. Purbright managed not to smile. We shall certainly speak to Mr. Briggs, but at present we have no evidence of his involvement. Goffin puffed up like a startled pigeon. "Then I must insist you act on my authority as counsellor. This incident reflects on the town's dignity, Inspector. We must appear decisive." Purbright's tone remained gentle, though his gaze held just enough firmness to redirect the counsellor. "Decisiveness, I find, is best accompanied by accuracy. Otherwise it becomes theatre." Goffin blinked, not entirely certain whether he had been complimented or rebuked. "Well, I expect progress," he muttered, and marched out with the air of a man expecting applause. Warlock exhaled deeply. "If we follow any more of his leads, we'll end up arresting half the youth orchestra." Purbright handed Love the statements. "Please ask Mr. Briggs to pop by when convenient." "Politely," he added, catching the flicker of eagerness in Love's eyes. "This is an inquiry, not an accusation." With that, Purbright slipped into his office, where the morning light slanted across the desk as if attempting to illuminate the mysteries piled upon it. He set down the statements and leaned back, fingers steepled. The convenient suspicion of Leonard Briggs fit too easily, too neatly, like a lid dropped onto the wrong box. A knock sounded softly at his door. Mrs. Teagle, the station secretary, peered in with her customary air of brisk confidentiality. "Inspector, Mrs. Laxby is here to see you, if you can spare a moment." Purbright straightened in mild surprise. "Please show her in." The mayor's wife entered with the poise of someone accustomed to public scrutiny. Yet a faint tremor at her gloved fingertips betrayed her composure. She closed the door gently behind her. "Inspector," she said, "I realized I should speak with you privately." Purbright rose and gestured to a chair. She sat, adjusting her handbag, as though bracing for something unpleasant. "Last night," she began quietly, "I said something you overheard." "Not again. I didn't intend to, invite questions, but I think I must explain." Purbright nodded but did not prompt her. Silence, in his experience, was a conversational solvent. "It was 10 years ago," she continued. "During the centenary celebrations at the old railway depot. Someone lit a candle there too, but it wasn't noticed until after the event. A small candle, in a saucer, with a timetable beside it, much like what you found last night." Purbright's interest deepened, though his expression remained mild. "Was there an investigation?" "No official one. It was dismissed as a sentimental gesture by an old rail enthusiast. But my husband, he was uneasy about it, and there were disagreements at the council afterwards." "About the Railway Society?" Purbright asked. She hesitated. "About a certain decision the council made regarding the depot, a matter that upset some people. I don't know more than that. My husband never discussed council business with me in detail." "But the candle troubled you," Purbright said gently. "Yes." Her voice tightened. It looked too deliberate, too familiar. He did not press her further. After she left, Purbright remained at the window for a long moment, watching her cross the market square with quick, purposeful steps. Her visit had not provided revelations, it had offered direction. Warlock appeared in the doorway. "Briggs is here, looks terrified." Purbright followed him to the interview room. Leonard Briggs sat rigidly in his chair, wearing the defiant expression of a boy expecting injustice. His too long fringe fell over anxious eyes. "Leonard," Purbright began kindly, "we're not accusing you of anything. We simply want to ask where you were during the concert last night." "At home," Leonard snapped. "My mum'll tell you I don't go to those daft concerts. I don't go anywhere near the Exchange." Purbright nodded. "Councillor Goffin suggested you may have been seen nearby." Leonard's outrage sharpened. "He hates young people. He always says we're vandals just for breathing near council property. He's got it in for me because of that cricket thing." "Were you anywhere near the riverside?" Warlock asked. Leonard shrugged. "Yeah. Before tea. Not during the concert. I was watching the ducks. Not a crime last time I checked." Purbright suppressed a smile. "Quite right. And your mother can confirm you stayed home afterward?" "Ask her," Leonard muttered. "And look, I wouldn't mess with candles. I nearly burned my eyebrows off once lighting a bonfire. Mum won't let me near matches now." Purbright believed him. There was no guile beneath the boy's irritation. Only a desire not to be someone's convenient scapegoat. When Leonard left, Warlock slumped into a chair. "Well, that's our nice, tidy suspect gone." "Convenience is seldom accuracy," Purbright said, "but the counsellor will not appreciate the distinction." Warlock rubbed his forehead. "So where does this leave us?" Purbright looked at the papers scattered across the table. Witness reports, vague sightings, and the faint echo of Mrs. Laxby's confession. All separate threads, but not unrelated. "It leaves us," he said calmly, with 2 candles, 10 years apart, both involving railway memorabilia, and a small group of people whose memories of that period may be more entangled than they admit. Warlock frowned. "And the motive?" "That," Purbright murmured, gathering the papers neatly, "is what we are about to discover, but I suspect the past is rehearsing itself upon a new stage." He stood, coat in hand. "Come, Superintendent. I think it is time we visited the old depot." Warlock followed, muttering, "I was afraid you'd say that." And together they stepped into the mist-softened square, where the faintest trace of old smoke and memory seemed to linger in the morning air, waiting patiently to be noticed. The old Flaxborough railway depot sat at the edge of town like a retired actor who had once played a minor but beloved role and now lived quietly on the outskirts of public memory. Its rusted gates, long unlatched, leaned inward as though bowing to the inevitable surrender of time. Even the pigeons that haunted its roofs seemed to coo with a kind of nostalgic melancholy. Inspector Purbright and Superintendent Warlock stood before the weathered entrance, taking in the silence. A breeze nudged a piece of loose tin somewhere on the roof, producing a hollow clatter that echoed through the empty yard. Warlock huffed. If the ghosts of railway enthusiasts are planning candlelit ceremonies, this would certainly be the place. Purbright smiled faintly. Ghosts rarely trouble themselves with timetables. They stepped into the depot's main hall. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, though patches of disturbance hinted at occasional visitors, trespassing children, curious wanderers, perhaps even 1 or 2 nostalgic relic hunters. The smell of old oil and forgotten machinery lingered stubbornly in the air, as if reluctant to leave entirely. Purbright walked slowly along the rows of abandoned benches and signage. "Mrs. Laxby mentioned a candle here 10 years ago. If the act was symbolic, then perhaps our present culprit is revisiting the gesture, not copying it." Warlock grunted. "Commemorative lunatic." "Or someone with a grievance," Purbright murmured. "Symbolism is often the language of those who wish to speak without being heard too loudly." They ventured into the smaller side office, once a booking clerk's room, where a broken clock hung permanently fixed at 4:15. On the ground beneath it lay something that made Purbright pause, a small indentation in the dust, roughly circular, as though something had rested there not too long ago. Warlock leaned over. "A candle base?" "Possibly," Purbright said, "or a saucer. The imprint suggests something shallow, not stable, like the one used backstage." He touched the surrounding dust lightly. "And here, see the faint lines?" Something was placed beside it, paper perhaps, about the size of a folded program or timetable. Warlock scratched his chin. So someone rehearsed their message here before performing it at the concert. Rehearsed, yes, Purbright said softly. Or remembered. They moved carefully around the depot, noting a few more disturbed patches of dust, though none held the clarity of that first impression. Finally, after circling back to the main hall, they emerged once more into the daylight. Warlock stretched his back with a grunt. So, someone's been using this place, and they're fond of candles and cluttered symbolism. It's like dealing with a criminal poet. Poetry often conceals truth, Purbright replied. In some hands more clumsily than others. They began the walk back toward the centre of town. As they passed the council offices, a familiar voice barked from behind them. "Inspector! Superintendent! I demand an update!" Councillor Goffin approached with the determined gait of a man marching into battle armed with indignation alone. His face held a shade too much triumph for comfort. "I've been thinking," he declared, "and I've come to an unavoidable conclusion. The boy Briggs may not be acting alone. There is a ringleader, someone guiding him." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "And who would that be?" "A certain retired station master," Goffin said with relish. "Mr. Bartholomew Kelk, known eccentric, obsessed with the old railway, always muttering about lost glory and vandalized history, a perfect candidate for this sort of railway ritual mischief." Warlock sighed so heavily it could have powered a small windmill. "Kelk is 83, Councillor." "Precisely," Goffin cried, "old enough to be unpredictable." Purbright resisted the urge to rub his temples. "Your theory is noted. We shall speak to Mr. Kelk." "See that you do," Goffin said, puffing out his chest. "Flaxborough depends on swift action." When he departed, Warlock muttered under his breath, "Swift action from the wrong direction." Purbright chuckled softly. Nevertheless, Mr. Kelk may indeed prove helpful, though perhaps not in the manner Goffin imagines. They continued toward the river, where the path passed a row of modest houses whose gardens overflowed with mismatched flowers and the occasional laundry line sagging with character. At the last of these homes sat Bartholomew Kelk himself, perched on a wooden stool and feeding crumbs to an unappreciative pigeon. He looked up with a polite bewilderment as the officers approached. "Morning, Inspector," he said, in a thin, cheerful voice. "Morning, Superintendent. Lovely day for the birds, though not for the roof tiles." Purbright greeted him warmly. "Mr. Kelk, we hope to ask you about the old railway depot. You used to work there, did you not?" "Oh, yes," Kelk said proudly. 38 years as station master. Would have made it to 40 if they hadn't closed the place. Shameful, that was." "Did you ever notice," Purbright asked carefully, "any peculiar habits among your colleagues? Rituals, perhaps? Remembrances? Anything involving candles, timetables, or symbolic arrangements?" Kelk blinked at him. "Candles? We used them during a power cut in '63, but that's hardly a ritual. As for timetables, well, they were everywhere. Couldn't move for them." "Did you or your colleagues leave little displays of objects?" Purbright asked. "Arranged items to mark an event or memory?" The old man chuckled. "Displays? Inspector, we were railway workers, not surrealist artists." Purbright smiled at this, but pressed gently. "Did you ever hear of someone lighting a candle at the depot after it closed?" Kelk tilted his head. "Ah, now that you mention it, there was an evening, years ago. I went back to fetch an old ledger I'd forgotten. Found a candle stub burning on a crate. Gave me quite a fright. No one else around. Never knew who'd lit it. Thought it was maybe some young fellow grieving the end of the line." "Did you mention it to anyone?" "Only to Jim Harbury," Kelk said. "He handled council property then. He told me not to worry. Said people get sentimental over old places." Purbright exchanged a glance with Warlock. "Do you know where Mr. Harbury is now?" Still in town, I think. Retired? Lives near the civic gardens. Warlock brushed a hand through his hair. So now we have a councillor, a former station master, a mysterious candle artist, and a town full of gossip. And, Purbright added quietly, a small arrangement of objects placed with care. Which brings us to the teacup. Warlock blinked. The teacup? It was cracked on one side, Purbright said, deliberately placed so the crack faced outward, and the timetable was from the final year before the depot closed, not a random choice. Kelk looked up sharply. Wait, did you say a cracked teacup? Yes, Purbright replied. Kelk frowned. There was a story, but perhaps I shouldn't say. Old gossip, Purbright nodded encouragingly. Old gossip often refreshes the present. Kelk sighed. Well, there used to be a woman who worked the ticket booth, Miss Eloise Fern, sweet soul. She had a teacup she always used. Cracked it one day when she got some bad news. No idea what. She never said. But after the closure, she went quiet. Stopped attending events. Kept to herself. Still in Flaxborough? Purbright asked. Yes, Kelk said softly. Lives near the library, I think. But she won't talk to anyone about the depot. Says some memories are better in shadow. Odd phrase, that. Purbright's expression grew thoughtful. Indeed. As they left Kelk's garden, Warlock exhaled heavily. So our neat picture grows messier? Messier, Purbright agreed, but clearer. The arrangement in the cupboard wasn't random. It was a message drawn from the past, and perhaps addressed to someone who would recognize it. Warlock frowned. Mrs. Laxby? Possibly, or someone close to her? Purbright paused, hands in his coat pockets. But the cracked teacup, that is not the councillor's memory, nor her husband's. That belongs to Miss Fern. Warlock grimaced. We'll have to talk to her then. Yes, Purbright said, but delicately. People do not hide memories without reason. They walked on, wrapped in the quiet hum of a town pretending to mind its own business, unaware that its past was beginning to stir again, piece by piece, like a forgotten display arranged by unseen hands. By the time Inspector Purbright and Superintendent Warlock reached the quiet residential lane where Miss Eloise Fern was said to live, the afternoon had sagged into that murky grey peculiar to Flaxborough, neither fog nor cloud, but a sort of atmospheric reluctance. The hedges along the pavement leaned toward each other like neighbours passing gossip across a fence. Purbright found the ambience oddly appropriate. Miss Fern's cottage was small and neat, almost excessively so, curtains drawn halfway despite the hour, garden trimmed to the precise geometry of someone whose life required order to fend off memory. Purbright knocked gently. After a long pause, footsteps approached with hesitant slowness. The door opened just far enough to reveal a pair of pale eyes behind spectacles. Yes. Purbright introduced himself and Warlock with the least intimidating arrangement of words he could muster. Miss Fern's expression tightened, but she did not shut the door. You're here about the depot, she said, her voice thin as folded paper. Purbright inclined his head. We hope to ask a few questions. Nothing intrusive. Everything about the depot is intrusive, she murmured. Yet she opened the door wider. Very well, but I don't have much to offer. She led them into a sitting room that bore the careful tidiness of a place rarely disturbed. The few ornaments, porcelain birds, old postcards, a railway lantern polished to improbable shine, spoke of decades layered quietly atop each other. She remained standing, hands clasped before her, like someone bracing for a blow. Purbright maintained his gentle tone. We've learned of an arrangement of objects placed backstage at the Corn Exchange last night. A candle, a timetable, a cracked teacup. We understand you once owned a cup with such a crack." At this, the colour drained slightly from her cheeks. "Who told you that?" "Mr. Kelk," Purbright said softly. "He remembered it fondly." Miss Fearn looked away, swallowing. "Fondly, I suppose someone must." Purbright waited. Patience, with some people, worked faster than pressure. She sank into a chair as though the effort cost her. "It wasn't the cup itself," she began. "It was the day it cracked, the day they told us the depot was closing. They said it wouldn't change much, that the line wasn't important anymore. But it was important. It was our life, our routine, and for some of us, more." Warlock shifted, uncomfortable. Purbright remained still, letting the words unfurl. "Someone else was upset that day," she said. "Someone far more than I was. A man who'd been close to the place. Close to me once." "Jim Harbury?" Purbright asked softly. She stiffened slightly, which was as good as an answer. He took it badly, blamed the council, blamed the town, blamed himself, I think. He had this notion that some things must be honoured properly when they die, even buildings, even rail lines. "And the candle?" Purbright asked. Miss Fearn hesitated. "Yes. He lit one after the final shift. I saw it from across the yard. I didn't say anything. He wasn't harming anyone, just grieving in his way." "Did he ever speak to you of using items, mementos, arrangements, to express that grief?" Her breath caught. He said once that memories should be placed like objects on a shelf, where you could see them clearly. Otherwise they go sour in the dark, he said. It was the sort of nonsense sentimental men say when they're trying not to cry. Purbright nodded with compassion. "Do you know where Mr. Harbury is now?" She shook her head. "We haven't spoken in years. He left the council after a big disagreement about funding, something to do with redevelopment plans. I didn't follow it closely." Her eyes softened with a painful kind of nostalgia. "But he wasn't cruel, not then, just wounded." Purbright thanked her quietly, and she showed them out with a sigh that seemed to come from some deep, hollowed place. As they stepped onto the lane again, Warlock exhaled. "So Harbury's our man?" "Possibly," Purbright replied. "But not conclusively." Miss Fearn spoke of him with affection. "People rarely conceal danger behind fondness. It's contempt we should fear." Warlock grunted. "Then where next?" "Back toward town," Purbright said. "I think our next threads lie among those who envy, resent, or have something at stake in this performance." They walked toward the civic gardens, where the town's most committed conversationalists had gathered despite the chill. Near a bench engraved with an earnest but ambiguous dedication, a group of choir members from the concert waited like a cluster of geological specimens, each expressive in their own sedimentary layers. The stout woman in the plum coat spotted them first. "Inspector, we heard you were investigating further. Have you found the culprit?" Purbright smiled politely. "Not yet. But we do value observations. You mentioned seeing someone unfamiliar backstage." "Yes," she said eagerly. "Tall, long coat, moved like a shadow. Not one of ours, and I never forget a face." Another choir member interjected. "You only saw his coat, not his face." "A coat tells plenty," the plum-coated woman snapped. Purbright thanked them, though he suspected their recollections were distortions of dim lighting and heightened nerves. But gossip, when sorted correctly, often delivered truths accidentally. As they turned to leave, a timid voice called, "Inspector?" A thin, bespectacled librarian approached, clutching a stack of overdue notices like a shield. Purbright recognized her from the library reading room. "I wasn't sure whether to say anything," she said, flustered, "but I overheard something strange yesterday. 2 people arguing near the corn exchange loading bay." Purbright's attention sharpened. "Who were they?" "I don't know. I only recognized the voice of Mr. Laxby, the mayor. He sounded upset. Something about the past being stirred where it shouldn't be. And unwelcome reminders. Purbright exchanged a glance with Warlock. "What about the other voice?" he asked. "I couldn't hear clearly," she replied. "It might have been a woman or someone speaking quietly. But Mr. Laxby kept repeating, 'Not now, not after all this time.'" Warlock exhaled. "So the mayor is involved in this mess." "Involved," Purbright said gently, "or affected?" They thanked the librarian and resumed their slow walk toward the high street. The puzzle felt less like an abandoned rail line now and more like a series of tracks crisscrossing under the surface, some still connected, some deceptively broken, and some leading into shadows few wished to revisit. As they approached the Chronicle office, a journalist burst out with theatrical urgency. "Inspector, Superintendent, a moment, please." Warlock muttered something impolite, but Purbright nodded. "What is it, Mr. Phipps?" Phipps pushed his spectacles up his nose with the eagerness of a man who sensed a headline trying to hatch. "Sources tell me a candle and some arrangement were left at the old station last night as well. Have you any comment?" Purbright's voice remained serene. "I would advise your sources not to trespass in derelict buildings. As for the rest, we are instructing no speculation." Phipps looked both defeated and thrilled. "So, there is a connection?" Purbright moved on without answering. Warlock walked beside him, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This is spiraling. We've got a retired station master with memories, a sentimental ex-councilman with rituals, the mayor with secrets, a shy librarian overhearing things, choir members inventing phantoms, and a fragile old woman with a past she'd rather bury. And," Purbright added softly, "someone arranging objects with exquisite care." Warlock sighed. "Which one of them is our culprit?" Purbright slowed his pace, eyes narrowing just slightly, with that particular quiet focus he never announced. "I'm not certain yet, but I suspect the answer does not lie in who remembers the past, but in who is afraid it will be remembered." Warlock stared at him. "Meaning?" Purbright's gaze drifted toward the corn exchange, faintly visible through the mist. "Meaning we should examine not only who might send a message, but who might receive one." The breeze shifted then, carrying with it the faint tang of wax, dust, and something else, something like the residue of a memory still burning. The remainder of the afternoon passed with Flaxborough drifting into the sort of restless quiet that usually preceded weather or scandal. In this case, it was the latter. By early evening, rumours had begun to thicken in the air, as though the whole town had taken to whispering behind cupped hands. Purbright felt the shift immediately. It was the change in atmosphere he relied upon more than evidence. Flaxborough seldom produced storms, but it always produced tremors. He and Warlock had just returned to the station when Constable Love hurried across the foyer, pink-faced and breathless. "Inspector, Superintendent, there's been another one." Warlock stopped mid-step. "Another what?" "A candle, sir," Love said, lowering his voice. "At the old station waiting room, arranged with objects again. A passer-by noticed the glow through the broken window and raised the alarm." Purbright's expression remained composed, but a quiet alertness sharpened beneath it. "How long ago?" 20 minutes, sir. Maybe less." Warlock snatched his coat from the rack. "Right. Let's move before half the town turns up with theories." As they crossed the market square, dusk slid into evening with a slow bluish seep. The lanterns flickered to life one by one like cautious witnesses. The path toward the old station seemed colder than it had that morning, the mist thickening as if resentful of their return. Purbright walked briskly, but without haste, the steady pace of someone accustomed to arriving precisely when he means to. When the waiting room came into view, it did so with a sullen glow leaking from one broken pane, a small, trembling flame illuminating the dust within. A handful of townsfolk lingered at a safe but curious distance, their breath rising in pale clouds. Warlock grumbled, "This is all we need, public spectacle." Purbright approached the door, which hung half off its hinges. Inside, the candle's flame cast soft shadows over an arrangement more elaborate than the first. A small, leather-bound notebook, a folded map of the old rail line, a button from a conductor's uniform, and, strangest of all, a single opera ticket from the previous night's concert. All placed with deliberate symmetry around the candle. Constable Love hovered behind them, wide-eyed. "It's like a ritual, sir." "Not a ritual," Purbright murmured. "A sequence." Warlock frowned. "Sequence of what?" "Memory," Purbright said, examining the objects without touching them. "But this display is more pointed than the last. Someone wants a particular person to recognize these items." The opera ticket caught his eye. It was creased slightly as though handled with nervous fingers. "This was purchased yesterday," he said. "But for whom? And why include it here?" Love ventured. "The baritone said someone meant to intimidate him." "Someone always means to intimidate the baritone," Warlock muttered. Purbright knelt beside the map. "This line," he said quietly, tracing it with his gaze, "was scheduled for closure earlier than the others, but the council delayed the decision. There were disagreements, accusations of mismanagement." Warlock shifted. "The mayor was on that committee, wasn't he, alongside Harbury?" "Yes," Purbright said softly. "And others, each with something to lose or protect." He stood, his eyes lingering on the candle's flicker. "This display feels like an escalation. The first was quiet, intimate. This one is larger, more visible, almost frustrated?" Warlock exhaled sharply. "Meaning our culprit's getting impatient." "Or fearful," Purbright said. "Fear often grows louder when ignored." He extinguished the candle with a soft breath, careful not to disturb the arrangement. Outside, the onlookers leaned forward, sensing the moment. Purbright addressed them calmly. "Not to worry, please return home. There is no danger." This, naturally, convinced none of them, but they dispersed with the obedient reluctance typical of Flaxborough citizens under direct instruction. As they walked away from the waiting room, Warlock shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets. "So what now, Inspector? We've got symbolism, nostalgia, concealed grievances, and the mayor muttering about unwelcome reminders, and now a second candle in a more public spot." Purbright walked thoughtfully, each step measured. "Now," he said, "we consider who has the emotional investment to repeat a gesture after 10 years, and who possesses the knowledge to make that gesture meaningful to a very specific audience." Warlock scowled. The mayor's wife recognized the first candle. Maybe the second was aimed at her too. "Perhaps," Purbright said, "but notice something. Neither display was placed where she would have found it directly. The first was backstage, seen by staff before it reached the public. The second, in the waiting room, relied on chance discovery." "So it wasn't meant to frighten someone," Warlock said slowly. "Just to be seen." Purbright nodded. "Yes, seen, not necessarily understood. Which suggests the message is aimed at someone who is expected to decode it." Warlock shook his head. "I don't like this. A person who thinks in symbols instead of words, never good news." Purbright allowed a faint smile. "Some people speak in memories because their truths are too tangled for conversation." They reached the river bridge, where the water slid beneath in black, unbroken sheets. Mist clung to the arches like old secrets. Purbright stopped mid-span, leaning lightly against the railing. "Superintendent," he said quietly, "think of the objects: a timetable, a cracked teacup, a map of the line, a conductor's button, a concert ticket. They are not random tokens, they are—" Warlock finished it for him. "Mementos." "Yes," Purbright said, "mementos placed deliberately. Someone is revisiting moments of a past they believe was mishandled." Warlock's voice dropped. "And if they're revisiting it, what comes next?" Purbright's gaze drifted toward the silhouette of the Corn Exchange in the distance, its roofline etched faintly against the rising fog. "Memory tends to circle back to the point of fracture," he said softly, "to the moment when something broke and was never repaired." "And what broke?" Warlock asked. Purbright did not answer immediately. Instead, he said, "We need to speak to Mr. Harbury, tonight." Warlock nodded grimly. "He lives near the gardens, not far." They turned from the bridge and headed up the lane where the street lamps flickered in uneasy intervals. The houses here were close set, each with its own peculiar charm, an idiosyncratic attempt at facade improvement. Harbury's cottage stood at the end, a narrow structure with a garden path swallowed by overgrown shrubs. Purbright knocked. No answer. Warlock tried again, louder. Still nothing. Purbright bent to examine the doorframe. The paint was smudged faintly, as though someone had brushed against it recently. He tested the handle gently. It gave, the door shifting a fraction. "Unlocked," Warlock muttered. "That's never a good omen." Purbright pushed the door open slowly. The interior lay dim, illuminated by the weak spill of lamplight from outside. Papers littered a small table. A coat hung crookedly on a peg. On the sideboard was a dusty mantel clock, long stopped. And on the floor, near the hearth, lay another candle, extinguished, its wick still warm. Purbright knelt beside it, his expression unreadable. "He was here, recently?" Warlock scanned the room. "Do you think he fled?" "I think," Purbright said softly, "he left in a hurry, and not because of us." Warlock's eyes narrowed. "You think he's in danger?" Purbright stood, gazing around the quiet room. "I think someone is rewriting the past, and Mr. Harbury may no longer be its author." A chill threaded the air, thin but unmistakable. Warlock swallowed. "So the person leaving the candles—" "May not be the person we expected," Purbright finished, his voice low. Outside, the mist thickened, muffling the world. A candle's message had been sent again, but now someone else might be receiving it. Someone whose silence carried its own warning. The lamplight from Harbury's deserted sitting room spilled weakly across the garden path as Purbright and Warlock stepped back outside. A hush followed them, the sort of hush that settles not from peace but from something half-seen retreating into shadow. Purbright paused on the threshold, absorbing the curious stillness, as though the air itself held its breath. Warlock tugged his coat tighter. "He can't have gone far, not at his age." Purbright nodded slowly. "Distance isn't the concern, Superintendent. Intent is." They walked in silence toward the lane, the mist moving around them like a creature with its own slow pulse. Purbright let his thoughts drift, not away from the case, but deeper into it. He had learned long ago that reflection was best done not at a desk, but in motion, with the world dim and unhurried. Flaxborough obligingly provided the perfect gloom for contemplation. He weighed the details, 2 candles now, each arranged with objects bearing symbolic meaning, both echoing an older gesture, an act of remembrance, perhaps sorrow, performed by Harbury years earlier. Yet Harbury had abandoned that ritual long ago. Something had stirred it back to life, or someone. They reached the bridge again, the river below moving in slow, almost reluctant coils. Purbright stopped at the midpoint, resting his hands lightly on the cold iron rail. Warlock hovered beside him, uneasy with pauses he could not fill. "What are you thinking?" he asked, though he sounded as though he'd regret hearing it. Purbright didn't look up. "The arrangement in Harbury's cottage. Did you notice the absence?" Warlock blinked. "Absence of what? Everything looked abandoned." "Precisely," Purbright said. "No letters, no personal notes, not even dust on the writing desk, as though Harbury had sorted through his private papers recently and removed something." Warlock frowned. "A confession? A plan? Something incriminating? Or something sentimental?" Purbright murmured. "Old men rarely flee with evidence. They flee with memory." Warlock pressed his lips together. "Do you think he's behind these displays after all?" Purbright's gaze followed the river's slow drift. If he were, he wouldn't leave a warm candle behind when running. A man revisiting ritual would complete it, not abandon it mid-step, and he certainly wouldn't leave an unlocked door. Warlock exhaled. "So someone else visited him?" "Yes." "And frightened him?" Purbright did not answer directly. "Let us consider motive. What purpose would a second candle serve? The first was hidden backstage, a private message. The second, in the waiting room, public, even risky. The person leaving them grows bolder. Why?" Warlock glared at the fog. "Because they think whoever they're targeting isn't listening." "Just so," Purbright said softly. "Which means we must look for someone who feels wronged, someone whose memory was dismissed, someone who believes the past was stolen and must now be restored, symbol by symbol." They resumed walking, moving through the dim, familiar streets. Purbright's steps slowed slightly as they approached the civic gardens, where the lamps cast long, uncertain shadows across the benches. The faint scent of wax still lingered in the air, almost imperceptibly, as though following him. Warlock noticed him sniff the air. "More candle smells?" "Possibly," Purbright said. "Or imagination, but imagination often borrows from truth." A rustling drew their attention. One of the gardeners, Mr. Elby, emerged from behind the hedges carrying half a broom and an air of wounded righteousness. "Inspector, Superintendent, I didn't want to bother the station at this hour, but since you're here, there's been someone skulking around these gardens tonight. I heard footsteps. Not mine. Not the cat's, either." Warlock pinched the bridge of his nose. "Elby, is there any chance it was simply the wind?" Elby looked offended. "The wind doesn't cough politely, Superintendent." Purbright's interest sharpened. "Cough?" "Yes," Elby insisted. "A little cough. Feminine, if you ask me, and muttering. Something about a map." Purbright exchanged a glance with Warlock. "Did you see where this person went?" "Toward the footpath behind the museum," Elby said, lowering his voice. "I didn't follow, my knee's playing up." Purbright thanked him and led Warlock toward the museum lane, a narrow path flanked by hedges and lamp-posts that flickered with indecisive electricity. They found no one there, but Purbright crouched near a patch of disturbed gravel. A footprint, small, neat, unmistakably feminine, pressed faintly into the damp earth. "Mrs. Laxby?" Warlock whispered. "No," Purbright murmured. "Her shoes would leave a sharper heel." He touched the edges of the print. Someone light-footed. Someone accustomed to careful movement. They continued down the lane, but the trail vanished at the corner where the footpath met the high street. Purbright paused there, hands in pockets, letting the night settle into place around him. A second candle, a footprint, a frightened old man, a map of the railway line, a concert ticket. Why the ticket? Why now? Warlock broke the silence. "Do you think Miss Fern could be behind this?" Purbright shook his head gently. "No, her grief is inward. These gestures are outward, and she lacks the confidence to trespass at night." "What about the mayor's wife? She's certainly troubled. Troubled, Purbright agreed, but not theatrical. Her anxieties reveal themselves in sighs and glances, not elaborate arrangements. Warlock scowled. Then who? Purbright's eyes wandered to the lamplight reflecting on the wet cobbles. Think of the ticket again. It was not the baritone's ticket. He keeps his close for autographs, nor the mayor's, nor Mrs. Laxby's. She left early before any encore. Someone else attended that concert, someone who did not wish to be noticed. Warlock frowned. Who sneaks into a concert? Purbright gave a small, thoughtful smile. People who crave witness without participation. He resumed walking, the fog wrapping him like a cloak. There is someone we have overlooked, someone who lingers at the edges of scenes, someone who watches rather than speaks. Warlock blinked. Kelk? No, Purbright said softly. Someone more recent, someone who was backstage often enough to observe everything, but was too timid to assert herself. Warlock's eyes widened. The backstage attendant? Purbright did not answer. Instead, he said, let's return to the station. We must review her earlier statements, particularly the detail she volunteered too quickly. Warlock followed, brow furrowed. Which detail? The claim that she shut the cupboard before the performance, Purbright said. It may be true, but it may also be an assertion meant to reassure herself as much as us. He slowed again as they approached the station steps. And she mentioned hearing light shoes with Mrs. Laxby. That may have been projection or memory. Warlock stopped abruptly. Inspector, what are you saying? That she's involved? That she's the one leaving these displays? Purbright's voice remained calm. I am saying she is frightened of the wrong things. She is anxious about cupboards and keys and misplaced objects, not because she fears blame, but because she fears discovery. Warlock swallowed. Then why involve Harbury? Purbright studied the misty darkness. Because Harbury is part of her past, but not its centre. Warlock stared at him, bewildered. You think she knew Miss Fearn, or the old railway staff? No, Purbright said quietly. But someone in her family did. Warlock's breath caught. Family? Purbright nodded. Sometimes, Superintendent, guilt travels not through actions but through inheritance. They entered the station, and the faint warmth of the foyer felt suddenly fragile, as though it might shatter with the wrong breath. Purbright paused at the threshold of his office. Tomorrow we speak to her again. Not as a witness, but as someone who may hold the missing piece of our railway puzzle. Warlock looked pale. Do you think she's dangerous? Purbright considered the question. Not intentionally, but people driven by grief or legacy can be unpredictable. He closed his office door gently, leaving the corridor dim and quiet. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick and muffling, like the breath of the past leaning closer for a better listen. Morning came with the hesitant brightness of a town unsure whether it ought to bother with daylight. Flaxborough's rooftops glistened damply, and the air carried that cold, metallic tang which suggested the weather had made a private arrangement with itself and intended to keep its plans secret. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station earlier than usual, his expression calm but inwardly focused, as though he were assembling something delicate in his mind. Superintendent Warlock joined him moments later, carrying 2 cups of tea and the grim determination of a man prepared for disagreeable revelations. If you're right about the girl, he began without preamble, we'll need to tread carefully. She's skittish enough without us cornering her. Purbright accepted the tea with a grateful nod. We are not cornering her, Superintendent. We are creating an opportunity for truth to present itself. Gently. Warlock snorted. That's one word for it. Purbright reviewed the girl's statements again, her insistence on closing the cupboard, Her certainty about light footsteps, her nervous glances when mentioning the Laxbys. Everything she had said was plausible, too plausible. It had the softness of a story padded with caution, but Purbright knew better than to confront her outright. Flaxborough's timid souls did not respond well to accusation. They collapsed like damp paper and yielded nothing but tears. What was needed was a situation arranged with the same care as the symbolic displays. The right objects, the right people, the right emotional lighting. So Purbright devised a small, polite trap. By mid-morning, he and Warlock stood once again outside the Corn Exchange. The air was cool, the hall unlit, the scent of wax faint but still there if one breathed with intention. The backstage corridor stretched dimly before them, the cupboard door shut tight. Purbright glanced at Warlock. "Ask Mrs. Laxby and Mr. Matchlock to join us shortly, and Mr. Kelk if he's able. Their presence will be illuminating." Warlock raised an eyebrow. "You're putting them all together?" "Some truths," Purbright said, "require a chorus." Warlock muttered something about strange choir arrangements, but obeyed. Purbright waited alone for a moment, allowing the quiet to settle. He looked once more at the cupboard, its wooden surface dull, its hinges protesting with age. Everything about it was ordinary. Yet ordinary things, he reflected, often carried extraordinary weight because people underestimated them. He heard footsteps, soft ones, before he saw her. The backstage attendant approached hesitantly, clutching a folder of sheet music, though she clearly had no intent to file anything. Her eyes flickered nervously from Purbright to the cupboard and back again. You wanted to see me, Inspector?" "Yes," Purbright said warmly. "Only to clarify some details from the other night. I value your observations." She relaxed slightly, flattered. "Of course. Anything that helps." Purbright moved casually toward the cupboard, placing himself so that she could see the handle but not feel threatened by proximity. "You told us you closed this door after rehearsal. A responsible habit." "Yes," she said quickly. "Yet someone opened it again shortly after." Her fingers tightened around the folder. "I suppose so." Purbright nodded. People often return to places that hold meaning for them. Cupboards, drawers, keepsake boxes, little spaces where memories are tucked away. The girl swallowed. I didn't go back in there, Inspector." "Of course." Purbright's tone held no accusation. "But you seemed especially certain about the timing, and certainty is usually the companion of familiarity." Her breath hitched. "I was just doing my job." Purbright shifted his gaze gently toward the corridor as faint footsteps announced the arrival of Mrs. Laxby. Then the baritone Matchlock, followed by old Mr. Kelk, shuffling with the dutiful enthusiasm of a veteran summoned to a reunion. Warlock escorted them, offering curt nods. The girl's eyes widened in alarm as the group gathered. Purbright addressed them all in his mild, courteous voice. "Thank you for coming. I believed it might be helpful to discuss the backstage arrangements together. Collective memory, after all, is often clearer than individual recollection." Matchlock puffed theatrically. "Is this an inquiry into artistic sabotage?" "No," Purbright said. "An inquiry into understanding?" Mrs. Laxby looked pale, her fingers twisting the clasp of her handbag. "Inspector, must we revisit this? That cupboard?" "Yes," Purbright said gently. "Because the message placed there was for someone, and I suspect you recognized it." She inhaled sharply, but said nothing. Purbright's attention shifted back to the backstage attendant. "You too recognized something, didn't you?" Her composure cracked. "No, I just—" Purbright interrupted softly. "You told us you heard light shoes accompanying Mrs. Laxby. but the only light shoes backstage that night belonged to you." She froze. "And you insisted on closing this cupboard," he continued, "yet your hands trembled when you mentioned it, not from fear of disobedience, but fear of what was inside." Tears sprang into her eyes.
"I didn't put anything in there." "No," Purbright agreed, "but you understood what the items meant." He opened the cupboard door slowly. Inside, only cleaning supplies remained, but the memory of the candle-lit display seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Purbright stepped aside. "Would you tell us what you recognized? Not who placed it, but why it frightened you?" The girl stared into the cupboard as though staring into a corridor of time. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was thin and cracked. "My father. He worked at the depot. He knew Mr. Harbury. They were friends once, close. He used to talk about how things went wrong during the closure, how someone hid the truth. He kept little keepsakes from the old station, a teacup, a timetable, a map. After he died, I thought I'd thrown everything away, but when I saw those things in the cupboard, arranged like he used to..." Purbright waited. Warlock, Mrs. Laxby, and even Matchlock remained silent. The girl pressed trembling fingers to her mouth. I thought he'd come back, or that someone knew what he'd said about the council, about Mr. Laxby, about the mistake that cost him his job." Purbright nodded gently. "Your father left Flaxborough abruptly, didn't he? Without explanation." She nodded, choking on a breath. "And he never recovered. He said he was blamed for something he didn't do." Mrs. Laxby sucked in a sharp breath. Purbright's gaze flicked toward her, not accusatory, simply observing the depth of her reaction. "Your father," Purbright continued to the girl, "wasn't the one behind those arrangements, but someone close to him, someone who shared his grievance might be." The girl sobbed softly. "I was so scared, and I thought the past was coming for me." Purbright touched her shoulder lightly. "Fear grows where truth has been withheld. That is not your fault." He turned to the group. "This was not an act of vandalism. It is a message from someone who wants an old wrong acknowledged, someone who believes the truth was buried." Warlock frowned. "And that someone is Harbury?" Purbright shook his head. "No, Harbury is running from something, not toward it." Mrs. Laxby closed her eyes, anguish tightening her features. "Inspector, I think I know who it might be." Purbright waited. She steadied herself. Harbury had a daughter. She was quiet, troubled. She adored the depot. When it closed, she blamed the council, blamed her father. And when he lost his position, well, she disappeared for a time. I heard she returned to town last winter, but I never saw her. Purbright's voice was barely above a whisper. "And her name?" Mrs. Laxby hesitated. "Marion Harbury." Purbright felt the air shift, the subtle, unmistakable sensation of a puzzle clicking into alignment. Warlock exhaled slowly. "So, she's the one leaving the displays?" "And," Purbright said
softly, "the one her father fled from." The backstage attendant looked up through tears. "Marion? But she used to visit our house when I was little. My father said she saw things she shouldn't have." Purbright closed the cupboard gently. "She is recreating the past to force it into view again, her father's shame, the council's silence, Miss Fairn's sorrow, and now she's escalating," Warlock finished grimly. Purbright nodded. "Yes, which means our gentle trap has worked. She now knows we are paying attention." Mrs. Laxby shivered. "What will she do next?" Purbright's voice remained calm. "That depends on whether she still believes the past can be corrected with symbols, or whether she decides to use something less gentle." Warlock swallowed. So how do we find her? Purbright looked once more at the cupboard, at the corridor, at the faces gathered. By inviting her to reveal herself, but not through force. He turned, his expression thoughtful, almost solemn. There is one place she will be drawn to. One place where the line began and ended for her. Tonight, Superintendent, we return to the old depot. Warlock stiffened. You think she'll go back there? She will, Purbright said, because that is where her story broke, and that is where she intends to mend it. Behind him, the candle's phantom glow seemed to linger in the air, quiet and waiting. Evening settled over Flaxborough like a heavy velvet curtain drawn by an unseen hand. The mist thickened early, softening lamps into faint halos and turning the streets into muted corridors of shadow. Inspector Purbright and Superintendent Warlock walked toward the old railway depot with the deliberate pace of men who expected an arrival, not of a train, but of truth. The depot loomed ahead, its skeletal outline rising from the fog with a quiet, uncanny presence. A single lamp near the entrance flickered, more as a courtesy than a service. Purbright stopped just short of the threshold and listened. The faint rasp of a draft moved through the abandoned building like a restless memory. Warlock broke the silence first. If she's here, Inspector, she won't welcome company. Then we must be especially cordial, Purbright said, stepping inside. The depot greeted them with a hush that clung to the air like old wool. Dust stirred at their feet, and the floorboards groaned under their weight. Yet Purbright sensed they were not alone. Not from sound. Marian Harbury seemed the kind of woman who moved with the caution of someone raised among sleeping ghosts, but from presence. Attention, a watchfulness, as though someone observed from just beyond the reach of lamplight. Purbright paused near the booking office door. Marian, he said softly, you know who we are, and we know who you are. Warlock swallowed but remained steady at Purbright's side. We are not here to accuse you, Purbright continued, only to talk, and only if you wish to. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then, from deeper within the hall, a faint scrape, a shoe brushing against loose grit. Warlock stiffened, but Purbright lifted a calming hand. It was thoughtful of you, Purbright said gently, to choose symbols instead of harm, the candle, the teacup, the timetable, the button. They speak softly, Marian, even when left in the dark. Another sound, closer this time, a breath. Then the shadow beside a row of abandoned trunks shifted and Marian Harbury stepped forward. She was a slim woman in her early 30s, dressed plainly in a coat too large for her frame. Her hair was tied back with hasty precision, though several strands had escaped and clung to her temples in the damp air. Her eyes, dark, watchful, restless, held the shape of old grief. Purbright inclined his head with a courtesy that seemed to catch her off guard. You came, she whispered. Yes, Purbright said. You expected us, I think. She gave a small, humourless laugh. I expected someone, maybe my father, maybe the council, maybe the past itself. As it happens, the police will do. Your father is safe, Purbright said gently. He left his cottage in a hurry, but not because of us. Her gaze flickered. He's ashamed, she murmured. He always has been. He wouldn't face what he did. Warlock spoke then, unable to contain himself. And what exactly did he do, Miss Harbury? Her shoulders stiffened, but Purbright's voice, calm and warm, drew her attention back. We would like to hear your version. You've gone to great lengths to remind others, but you haven't told anyone your own truth. Marian swallowed hard, her breath trembling slightly. My father was blamed for the closure. People whispered, said he misfiled documents, lost funding papers, ruined the depot. But he didn't. He was covering for someone else, someone in the council who mishandled the grants, someone who let the railway die. Her gaze sharpened, fragile yet fierce. They let him take the blame. They let him break. Purbright nodded, absorbing each word without judgment. And the someone else? Marion's voice dropped. Mayor Laxby, but no one would listen, not then, not now. I tried, years ago, to bring it up quietly. He brushed me off, said the past was untidy and best left folded away. Warlock muttered, typical politician. Purbright's eyes remained on Marion. So the candles were, what, reminders? Yes, she said, voice trembling with sincerity. Reminders of what they buried. My father's cracked teacup. He dropped it the day the depot closed. The timetable, the last schedule he ever posted. The button, his uniform jacket missing one that day because he'd been pulling down signs. The map, drawn for the redevelopment plan that never came. And the opera ticket because last night Mayor Laxby walked into that hall as, though nothing in his life had ever been done dishonestly. Her breath hitched. She pressed a hand to her chest, as though steadying a wound. I couldn't let it stay hidden. Purbright stepped forward, with the cautious grace of a man offering an unspoken hand. And you hoped the displays would unsettle him enough to confront his past? She nodded. I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted him to acknowledge what he did, what he allowed, what it cost us. Warlock exhaled sharply. And Harbury. What did he think of your campaign? Marion closed her eyes. He found out 2 nights ago. He begged me to stop. Said the town had moved on. Said I didn't understand how complicated it had been. But I do understand. I understand too well. Purbright's voice softened. He feared the pain of reopening old wounds. She nodded again. He said he'd lose what reputation he had left, that people wouldn't believe the truth after all these years. He told me the past is only a burden if we insist on dragging it behind us. And you? Purbright asked. I think the past is a debt, she whispered, and it comes due eventually. Purbright stood silent for a moment, the depot settling around them like an old theatre after the final act. When he finally spoke, it was with the calm precision of someone stitching threads together. Marion, your actions were symbolic. They were meant to provoke thought, not harm. But symbols, once public, can take on lives of their own. They can frighten, confuse, even mislead. Her eyes filled with tears. I know, I didn't mean to frighten Mrs. Laxby, or the staff, or the girl backstage. She was a childhood friend, but though she barely knows me now. Purbright nodded. Fear responds poorly to subtlety. Even gentle gestures can cast long shadows. She looked down, voice cracking. Am I under arrest? Purbright exchanged a glance with Warlock, then shook his head slowly. No, not tonight. But we cannot leave the truth in pieces. The mayor must hear what you've said, and your father too. They deserve clarity, not candlelit reminders. Marion let out a shaky breath, half relief and half dread. Will they listen? Purbright offered a small, warm smile. If they won't, I will. Something eased in her shoulders, the first release of tension since her arrival. Purbright extended a hand slightly, not touching, merely offering presence. Come with us. Let's talk somewhere warmer than this place of ghosts. She hesitated, then nodded. As they guided her toward the depot entrance, Purbright cast one final glance back into the dim hall. A place of endings, but tonight of beginnings too. Warlock murmured, You handled that well, Inspector. Purbright gave a faint, thoughtful hum. The truth is rarely revealed by force, Superintendent, more often by offering someone a place to set it down. Outside, the night had softened. The mist no longer pressed against them like a warning, but drifted with gentler purpose. Marian walked between them quietly, not defeated, but unburdening. The past, long hidden in cupboards and waiting rooms, was finally stepping into the light, and Purbright, with the calm certainty of a man who understood human nature better than most, knew the next step would be the simplest and the hardest, telling the town a truth it had forgotten it once buried. Morning in Flaxborough crept in with its usual apologetic pallor, as though the daylight had been delayed by a council subcommittee and arrived only after much bureaucratic reluctance. The fog that had haunted the town for days finally began to thin, retreating from the rooftops like a rumour that had lost its nerve. Inspector Purbright walked toward the mayor's residence with the same quiet composure he'd carried through the entire case, though a faint weight settled in the lines around his eyes. Superintendent Warlock accompanied him, tugging his scarf irritably. "Do we have to do this now? Couldn't the mayor wait until he's had breakfast?" "He requested an early meeting," Purbright said mildly. "His conscience seems to wake earlier than his schedule." Warlock grunted. "That'll be the first time." They reached the Laxby residence, a modest, well-kept house that dressed itself in the dignity the mayor occasionally lacked. Mrs. Laxby opened the door before they knocked, her expression taut but composed. She ushered them into the sitting room, where Mayor Laxby paced near the fireplace like a man rehearsing a speech he dreaded to deliver. He stopped when he saw them. Superintendent, thank you for coming. My wife said there were developments." Purbright inclined his head. "There are. And they concern you, Mr. Laxby, though perhaps not in the way you fear." The mayor's eyes shifted nervously. "I've not slept. I keep recalling that candle in the cupboard and the one at the station. There's something familiar in it all, but I haven't been able to place it." Mrs. Laxby sat beside him, laying a steadying hand on his arm. Purbright waited a moment for silence to settle. "Mr. Laxby," he began gently, "Marian Harbury has been found. She is safe and willing to speak with you." The mayor froze. "Marian, after all these years? Why would she—" Purbright continued quietly. "She wishes to address a matter left unresolved during the closure of the old depot, something she believes you mishandled." Laxby winced. "It was a difficult time, Inspector. Lines were closing everywhere. We had budget constraints. No one knew what to do. I may have made mistakes." "Not criminal ones," Purbright said, "but human ones." Warlock, surprisingly gentle, added, "She's not looking to ruin you. She wants acknowledgement." The mayor's shoulders slumped with slow relief, though traces of old guilt clung heavily. Harbury was a good man, better than people gave him credit for. But the council needed a scapegoat when the redevelopment funds vanished in that administrative tangle. He didn't deserve the blame. Mrs. Laxby blinked at him. "You never told me that." "I couldn't," the mayor murmured. "It was complicated, embarrassing, and by the time I saw how the fallout affected his daughter, the moment to speak had passed." Purbright's tone softened even further. "It seems she hopes the moment has arrived again." The mayor covered his face with his hands. "If I meet her, what am I supposed to say?" "The truth," Purbright said simply. "Without embellishment or excuses, people often survive honesty better than we expect." The Laxbys exchanged a long look, one of those marital glances filled with unspoken agreements, regrets, and understandings. Mrs. Laxby finally nodded. "You must speak with her." Purbright arranged the meeting for later that morning in the mayor's private office. Warlock fussed with paperwork, but Purbright merely waited, calm, contemplative, as if listening to the town breathe. When Marion arrived, she stepped into the office with visible hesitation, her eyes flicking nervously between Purbright and the mayor. The room's warmth contrasted sharply with the chill outside, and yet she looked as though she carried a coldness of her own. The mayor stood. "Marion, it has been a long time," she answered with a small nod. "Too long, perhaps." Purbright took a seat off to the side, not intrusive, but present. Warlock stood nearer the door, pretending not to listen closely. The mayor exhaled. "Your father was wronged. I've known that for years. I never knew how to put it right." Marion's breath trembled. "But you let him carry the blame. You let the town whisper about him." "Yes," the mayor said. "I did, and I shouldn't have. I was overwhelmed. I was afraid. I thought, if we admitted our mishandling, the public would lose faith in us. I told myself it didn't matter, that your father was strong enough to endure it. I was wrong about everything." Marion's expression cracked between hurt and bewildered relief. "I wasn't trying to ruin you. I just wanted someone to admit that I wasn't imagining it, that what happened was real." The mayor nodded. "It was real and devastating, and I am deeply, sincerely sorry." Purbright watched the exchange unfold gently, like a knot loosening. The room's energy shifted, not dramatically but subtly, as though something long neglected had finally been placed where it belonged. Marion's shoulders sagged, the tension she had carried dissolving into something near exhaustion. "I didn't know how else to make you remember." "No one taught us how to remember properly," the mayor said softly. "Least of all how to remember pain." There was silence then, heavy but no longer suffocating. Purbright finally rose. "There is no need for legal
action, Marion. Your gestures were symbolic, not harmful. But we will ask that you refrain from further displays. The town has grown nervous." Marion nodded. "I'm done. I only needed the truth." Purbright's eyes softened. "Then the truth has served its purpose?" She looked at him with a fragile gratitude. "Thank you, Inspector. You treated me like a person, not a problem." Purbright offered a faint smile. "Most problems arise when people are not treated like people." Marion took her leave, escorted quietly by Mrs. Laxby, who embraced her with unexpected warmth. The mayor sank into his chair, drained but lighter in spirit than he had been in years. Warlock approached. "So, finished?" "Nearly," Purbright said. "One more visit." Warlock groaned. "Please tell me it's not Goffin." Purbright chuckled softly. "No. Harbury." They found the old man sitting on a bench near the civic gardens, feeding crumbs to birds who had absolutely no interest in anything but crumbs. When Purbright sat beside him, Harbury turned with startled guilt, then relief when he saw no accusation in the inspector's eyes. "Your daughter is safe," Purbright said gently. "She only wanted truth, not trouble." Harbury's eyes glassed over. "She's always carried my burdens heavier than I did." "Not heavier," Purbright replied. "Only more quietly." Harbury nodded with a sad smile. "Is it over then?" "Yes," Purbright said. "The candles need not burn any more." The old man sighed with long-awaited release. Warlock tugged Purbright's sleeve. "Paperwork?" Purbright rose smoothly. "Always." They returned to the station, where the day had begun to brighten in earnest. The fog lifted, the streets cleared, and Flaxborough resumed its routine with the resilient dignity of a town accustomed to bumps in its quiet road. Purbright sat at his desk, pen poised, the faint smell of wax still lingering in his thoughts. Human motives, he reflected, were rarely wicked. More often they were tangled, unresolved, stitched with sorrow and stitched poorly at that. His role was never to tear those seams, but to ease them apart until the truth could breathe. As he signed the final form, he allowed himself a small moment of stillness. Outside, the town moved on, as it always did. And so did he.